Bullies stripped her shirt in front of Crush. She sent him flying. Kendra Thorne had always been the kind of person who preferred shadows to spotlights, invisible corners to center stage, silence to the cacophony of teenage social warfare that echoed through Jefferson High School's sterile hallways every single day. At 17, she had perfected the art of existing without truly being seen, moving through the corridors like a wraith, draped in oversized flannel shirts that hung loose over her petite 5'4" frame, her dark chestnut hair perpetually falling across her face like a protective curtain she could hide behind whenever the world became too overwhelming to bear. Jefferson High School was a sprawling brick monument to public education, built in the 1970s with that particular blend of institutional functionality and complete disregard for aesthetic appeal that characterized so many American high schools. The hallways stretched endlessly, lined with dented metal lockers painted in a shade of green that could only be described as institutional nausea, punctuated by bulletin boards covered in faded announcements about college prep courses, upcoming dances, and sports team victories that most students had already forgotten. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow that made even the most confident students look slightly sickly. It was in these hallways that Kendra had learned to become invisible. She was the girl teachers forgot to call on, despite her consistently high grades and thoughtful answers when she did speak up. She was the one who sat alone at lunch in the far corner of the cafeteria, always with a book propped against her thermos. Usually something thick and substantial, like a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, or a dense historical novel about the Civil War, creating a barrier between herself and the social minefield that surrounded her. She was the student who had perfected the timing of her movements between classes, knowing exactly when to leave each classroom to avoid the crush of bodies in the hallways, which routes to take to minimize unwanted interactions, and how to position herself in any room to remain as unnoticed as possible. Her classmates saw her as just another quiet kid, unremarkable and forgettable. They might have been surprised to know that Kendra observed everything with the sharp attention of someone who had learned early that survival often depended on reading the social currents around her. She could tell you which couples were on the verge of breaking up based on their body language in the hallways, which teachers were having personal problems based on the subtle changes in their classroom management styles, and which students were struggling with issues at home based on the way they carried themselves between classes. But what absolutely nobody at Jefferson High School knew about Kendra Thorne was that every evening after school, she climbed into her beat-up 1998 Honda Civic, a car her father had bought for $300 from a junkyard and spent 2 months helping her restore, and drove 23 minutes through the winding back roads outside town to Master Kim's martial arts studio, where she had been training in mixed martial arts with an intensity and dedication that bordered on obsession for the past 6 years. The studio was located in a converted warehouse in an industrial part of town that most of Jefferson High's students had never even seen. From the outside, it looked like nothing special, just another gray metal building with a small sign that read Kim's Traditional Martial Arts in simple black letters. But inside, it was a different world entirely. The main training floor was covered in thick mats that smelled faintly of sweat and determination, surrounded by mirrors that reflected the disciplined movements of students practicing their forms. Heavy bags hung from the ceiling like silent sentinels, marked with the impact of thousands of kicks and punches. Traditional weapons, nunchucks, bow staffs, and swords lined the walls in neat rows, and motivational posters featuring famous martial artists and philosophical quotes about discipline and respect were scattered throughout the space. Master Kim himself was a small, compact man in his late 50s, with graying black hair and hands that bore the calluses and scars of decades spent perfecting his craft. He had immigrated to the United States from South Korea 30 years ago with nothing but his martial arts training and an unshakable belief that discipline could transform lives. He spoke with a slight accent that became more pronounced when he was demonstrating a particularly complex technique or emphasizing an important point about philosophy and respect. Kendra's journey to Master Kim's studio had begun 6 years ago, shortly after her mother's death in a car accident that had shattered her father's world and left 12-year-old Kendra adrift in a sea of grief she was too young to fully understand. Robert Thorne, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before settling into civilian life as a mechanic at the local auto shop, had struggled to raise his daughter alone while dealing with his own crushing depression and survivor's guilt. He had seen too many fellow veterans struggle with PTSD and substance abuse, and he was determined not to become another statistic, especially with Kendra depending on him. "You need to know how to defend yourself, sweetheart," he had told her one evening as they sat in their small kitchen, picking at a dinner of microwaved mac and cheese and canned green beans. "The world can be a dangerous place, especially for someone small like you. Your mom would have wanted you to be able to take care of yourself." He had researched martial arts schools for weeks, driving to different studios and watching classes, asking detailed questions about philosophy and teaching methods. Most of the instructors he met were more interested in selling memberships than understanding what a grieving 12-year-old girl might need from martial arts training. But Master Kim had been different. He had sat down with both Kendra and her father, explaining that martial arts was not just about learning to fight, but about developing discipline, confidence, and respect for oneself and others. "Fighting is last resort," Master Kim had explained in his careful English, his dark eyes serious as he looked at young Kendra. "First, we learn to walk away. Second, we learn to de-escalate. Third, we learn to defend. Fighting is when all other options are gone. But if you must fight, you fight to end it quickly and safely with minimum harm to all involved." Kendra had thrown herself into the training with a quiet intensity that surprised even Master Kim. While other students her age seemed more interested in the flashy kicks and dramatic throws they saw in movies, Kendra absorbed every lesson about breathing, balance, and mental discipline. She learned to channel her grief and anger into her training, spending hours perfecting basic techniques until they became as natural as breathing. Over the years, she had progressed through the belt ranks with steady determination. She learned traditional karate forms and modern mixed martial arts techniques, studying everything from Aikido joint locks to Brazilian jiu-jitsu ground fighting. She could throw a grown man twice her size using leverage and technique rather than brute strength, could break boards with her bare hands using proper form and focus, and had won 3 regional tournaments fighting under the name Kim Thorne, using Master Kim's surname to avoid any attention at school. Her training had become a sacred ritual, a way to honor her mother's memory and connect with her father, who often came to watch her practice and had learned some basic techniques himself as a way of bonding with his daughter. In the studio, Kendra was not the invisible girl from Jefferson High. She was a skilled martial artist, respected by her fellow students and trusted by Master Kim to help teach newer students. She had found her confidence and her voice within those mirrored walls, even if she kept both carefully hidden during school hours. The contradiction between her school persona and her martial arts identity was intentional and carefully maintained. Kendra believed deeply in Master Kim's teachings about the responsibility that came with martial arts knowledge. She had seen too many movies and heard too many stories about people using their fighting skills to become bullies themselves, and she was determined never to become the thing she despised. At school, she chose to absorb the small cruelties and casual dismissals of her classmates rather than risk revealing the dangerous skills she had spent years developing. "Pick your battles, sweetheart," her father would say whenever she came home frustrated by some minor injustice at school. Some fights aren't worth winning, and some victories cost more than they're worth. You'll know when it's time to stand up for yourself. Your gut will tell you. Until then, keep your head down and stay out of trouble. Robert Thorne had his own reasons for encouraging his daughter's patience. He had seen what happened when people with military or martial arts training got into altercations with civilians, how quickly a simple fight could escalate into serious legal trouble or even tragedy. He was proud of Kendra's skills and her discipline, but he also knew that the world would judge a teenage girl who hurt someone in a fight very differently than it would judge a teenage boy in the same situation. So Kendra endured. She endured the casual invisibility, the way conversations stopped when she approached and resumed after she passed, the subtle exclusions from group projects and social events. She endured the occasional snide comment about her thrift store clothes or her habit of eating lunch alone with a book. She endured it all with the quiet stoicism of someone who knew exactly how much damage she could inflict if she chose to, and who had made the conscious decision not to. But endurance has its limits, and Kendra Thorne was about to discover exactly where hers lay. Blake Morrison was everything that Kendra Thorne was not, and he knew it with the kind of bone-deep confidence that could only come from 17 years of having the world bend to accommodate his whims. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of someone who had been gifted with excellent genetics and had the good sense to maintain them through regular workouts, Blake moved through Jefferson High School like a king surveying his domain, secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, at the top of the social hierarchy. His thick blonde hair was always perfectly styled in that effortless way that actually required significant effort and expensive products, falling across his forehead in carefully calculated waves that caught the fluorescent hallway lights just right. His blue eyes were the color of summer sky, bright and clear and utterly confident in their assessment of the world around him. When Blake smiled, which he did often and strategically, it was with the easy charm of someone who had never been told no about anything that really mattered to him. Blake came from the kind of family that Jefferson's small-town community considered royalty. His father, Richard Morrison, owned Morrison Construction, the largest building contractor in the county, responsible for most of the new housing developments and commercial buildings that had sprung up around town in the past decade. The Morrison family lived in a sprawling colonial mansion on Maple Street, the kind of house that appeared on the covers of real estate magazines and made other residents feel inadequate about their own perfectly reasonable homes. Richard Morrison had been a football star at Jefferson High back in his day, and he expected nothing less than excellence from his son in all endeavors. Blake had inherited his father's athletic ability and competitive drive, but he had also inherited something darker, a need to establish dominance over others, to prove his superiority not just through his own achievements, but by diminishing those around him. Where his father had learned to channel this impulse into business success and community leadership, Blake was still young enough to express it in the cruder currency of high school social warfare. Blake's mother, Patricia Morrison, was a former beauty queen who had won Miss Jefferson County 3 years running before marrying Richard and settling into the role of perfect suburban wife and mother. She volunteered for every important charity in town, organized the annual hospital fundraiser, and made sure the Morrison family was prominently featured in the society pages of the local newspaper. Patricia had taught Blake early that image was everything, that perception was reality, and that maintaining one's position in the social hierarchy required constant vigilance and strategic thinking. At Jefferson High, Blake was the undisputed king of the senior class. He played varsity football and baseball, maintaining solid B+ grades that were good enough to keep him eligible for sports without requiring any real academic effort. Teachers loved him because he was polite and charming in class, always quick with a respectful "yes, ma'am" or "no, sir" that reminded them of their own youth and made them overlook his more questionable behaviors. He had been dating Ashley Chen, the head cheerleader and student council vice president, for 2 years in a relationship that looked perfect from the outside and was perfect by the shallow standards that governed teenage social status. But Blake Morrison had a problem, one that he couldn't solve with his father's money, his mother's social connections, or his own considerable charm. Deep down, beneath the confident exterior and easy smile, Blake was desperately insecure. He lived in constant fear that someone would discover he wasn't as smart, as talented, or as naturally superior as he pretended to be. The pressure to maintain his position at the top of the social ladder was exhausting, requiring him to constantly prove and reprove his dominance over his classmates. This insecurity expressed itself in a need to find and exploit the weaknesses of others, particularly those he perceived as threats or those who were simply convenient targets. Blake had developed a sophisticated understanding of high school social dynamics, knowing instinctively which students he could safely target without facing any real consequences. He was careful to avoid anyone with powerful parents, serious mental health issues that might bring unwanted attention from counselors, or friends who might retaliate on their behalf. His best friend and primary accomplice was Tyler Kane, a stocky kid with mean brown eyes and a perpetually cruel smile who followed Blake around like a faithful attack dog. Tyler was the son of Tom Kane, who owned the local sporting goods store and coached Little League baseball on weekends. Where Blake's cruelty was calculated and strategic, Tyler's was more instinctive and brutal. He genuinely enjoyed causing pain and humiliation, while Blake simply saw it as a necessary tool for maintaining his social position. Tyler stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall with a wrestler's build, thick through the chest and shoulders, with arms that looked like they belonged on someone older and more mature. His dark hair was always buzz-cut short, military style, and his face had the kind of square-jawed handsomeness that would have been attractive, if not for the constant undercurrent of malice in his expression. He laughed too loud at Blake's jokes, agreed too enthusiastically with Blake's opinions, and seemed to live for the moments when Blake would give him permission to unleash his natural cruelty on some hapless victim. The two of them had been inseparable since middle school, when Tyler's family had moved to Jefferson from a larger city where his father's previous sporting goods business had failed. Tyler had arrived angry and resentful, looking for someone to blame for his family's diminished circumstances. Blake had recognized a kindred spirit and taken Tyler under his wing, offering him a place in the social hierarchy in exchange for absolute loyalty and unquestioning participation in whatever schemes Blake might devise. Together, they had made Jefferson High School their personal kingdom, ruling through a combination of Blake's charm and Tyler's willingness to do the dirty work that Blake preferred to keep at arm's length. They had perfected the art of plausible deniability, making their harassment look accidental or justified, always ready with innocent explanations if any adult asked uncomfortable questions. Their typical victims were carefully chosen: students without powerful friends, those from families with limited social influence, kids who were different in ways that made them easy targets. They had tormented a kid with a stutter until he switched schools, made life miserable for a girl whose family couldn't afford name-brand clothes, and driven more than one sensitive student to eat lunch in empty classrooms to avoid their attention. The method was always the same. Blake would identify a target and begin with small harassments, a casual insult disguised as a joke, a strategic shoulder check in a crowded hallway, a subtle exclusion from group activities. If the victim responded with anger or tried to fight back, Blake would escalate gradually, always maintaining his public image as a good kid who was just defending himself against an unreasonable classmate. If the victim ignored the harassment or tried to avoid confrontation, Blake would interpret this as weakness and permission to intensify his attacks. Most victims eventually found ways to avoid Blake and Tyler, switching lunch periods, taking different routes between classes, dropping out of activities where they might encounter their tormentors. This suited Blake perfectly, as it reinforced his dominance without requiring him to invest too much time and energy in any single target. The goal was never to completely destroy anyone, just to make sure everyone understood where they stood in the social hierarchy and what would happen if they tried to challenge his position. But 3 weeks into their senior year, Blake Morrison made a decision that would prove to be the biggest mistake of his high school career. He decided that quiet, invisible Kendra Thorne would be his new target. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, during that awkward transition period when summer's heat was finally beginning to give way to the crisp promise of autumn. Kendra had been rushing to her AP history class, her arms full of textbooks and her oversized flannel shirt catching on her backpack straps, when she made the mistake of taking the same route through the main hallway that Blake Morrison and Tyler Kane happened to be using. Blake noticed her immediately, not because there was anything particularly remarkable about Kendra herself, but because she represented exactly the kind of target he had been looking for. She was small and quiet, clearly uncomfortable with attention, and she moved through the school with the careful deliberation of someone who was trying very hard not to be noticed. More importantly, she was alone. No group of friends to rally to her defense, no boyfriend to complicate matters, no obvious family connections that might cause problems if things escalated. "Check it out," Blake murmured to Tyler, nodding in Kendra's direction as she hurried past them with her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "Little mouse girl, never seen her talk to anyone, never seen her at any parties. Probably doesn't even know our names." Tyler's eyes lit up with the anticipation of a predator spotting easy prey. She looked scared of her own shadow. This could be fun. Blake's initial assessment was clinical and calculating. Kendra Thorne was exactly the kind of student who made him feel superior by comparison. Invisible where he was prominent, isolated where he was popular, uncertain where he was confident. She seemed to embody everything he despised about weakness and social irrelevance, and targeting her would serve multiple purposes. It would entertain Tyler, who was always pushing for more aggressive harassment campaigns. It would reinforce Blake's position as someone who could make or break another student's high school experience with minimal effort. And it would provide him with a convenient outlet for the growing pressure he felt to maintain his image as Jefferson High's undisputed alpha male. The first incident was carefully planned to appear accidental. Blake positioned himself near Kendra's locker during the morning rush between first and second period, timing his movement so that he would bump into her just as she was trying to balance her books while working her combination lock. The collision sent her textbooks scattering across the hallway floor, their pages splaying open as they slid across the worn linoleum. "Oh, sorry," Blake said loudly, his voice carrying just enough false concern to sound genuine to any teachers or administrators who might be listening. "Didn't see you there. You really should be more careful in these crowded hallways." Kendra knelt to gather her books, her face flushing with embarrassment as other students stepped around and sometimes on her scattered belongings. She mumbled an apology, even though the collision had clearly been Blake's fault, her voice so quiet that most people probably couldn't hear her over the normal hallway noise. "What was that?" Blake asked, leaning down as if he genuinely wanted to hear her response. "You really should speak up, you know. No one's going to notice you if you whisper all the time." Tyler laughed loudly at this observation, drawing the attention of nearby students who were beginning to slow down to watch the interaction. Some of them looked uncomfortable, sensing that something cruel was happening, but uncertain whether they should intervene. Others seemed mildly entertained by the prospect of drama breaking up the monotony of another school day. Kendra finished collecting her books and stood up, still not making eye contact with Blake or Tyler. She clearly wanted nothing more than to escape the situation as quickly as possible, but Blake wasn't quite finished with her yet. "You know, I don't think I've ever heard you talk in any of our classes," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of exaggerated curiosity. "Are you actually capable of speaking at normal volume, or is whispering just your thing?" A few of the watching students chuckled at this, more out of nervousness than genuine amusement. They could sense Blake's underlying hostility, but his words were phrased as innocent observations rather than direct insults. This was Blake's specialty, the ability to humiliate someone while maintaining plausible deniability, to make his victims feel small while appearing to be nothing more than a curious classmate making conversation. Kendra mumbled another apology and hurried away toward her next class, her shoulders hunched and her head down. Blake watched her go with satisfaction, already planning his next move. The incident had gone perfectly. He had established dominance, entertained his audience, and identified what appeared to be a victim who wouldn't fight back or cause complications. Over the next few days, Blake began to escalate his campaign against Kendra with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. He started with small harassments that could easily be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. A strategic shoulder check in the hallway that sent her stumbling into a group of chattering sophomores who looked at her with annoyance for interrupting their conversation. A casual comment about her thrift store flannel shirt that was just loud enough for the students sitting near them in study hall to hear and quietly laugh about. The cafeteria provided Blake with some of his best opportunities for harassment. Jefferson High's cafeteria was a vast space filled with round tables that seated 8 students each, and the seating arrangement served as a daily reminder of everyone's place in the social hierarchy. The popular kids claimed the tables near the windows, where they could see and be seen by everyone entering the room. The athletes sat together near the serving line, close enough to go back for seconds without losing their seats. The various academic and special interest clubs clustered in the middle section, while the social outcasts and loners were relegated to the tables along the far wall, near the kitchen doors, where the constant stream of cafeteria workers made conversation difficult. Kendra always sat alone at a small table in the farthest corner, usually with a book propped against her thermos and a simple brown bag lunch that she ate methodically while reading. Her isolation made her an easy target for Blake's particular brand of psychological warfare. He discovered that he could walk past her table while carrying his lunch tray and accidentally jostle her chair just hard enough to make her spill her drink or drop her sandwich. He could stop at the condiment station near her table and make comments about the weird girl who never talks to anyone that were clearly intended for her to overhear. The classic move that generated the most laughs from his audience was pulling out her chair just as she was about to sit down. Blake would time this perfectly, waiting until Kendra was completely focused on opening her book or unwrapping her lunch, then quickly sliding her chair backward just far enough that she would miss it when she tried to sit down. The result was always the same. Kendra would land hard on the floor, her face burning with embarrassment, while the surrounding tables erupted in laughter. "Oh man, sorry about that," Blake would say, rushing to help her up with an expression of exaggerated concern. "The chair must have been loose or something. Are you okay? You really should pay more attention to where you're sitting." Each incident followed the same pattern. Blake would create a humiliating situation, offer false sympathy that actually made the humiliation worse, and then walk away while Kendra was left to deal with the aftermath alone. The other students in the cafeteria had learned to watch for these performances, and some had even started placing informal bets on what Blake would do next and how Kendra would react. But it was Blake's discovery of Kendra's habits in the library that allowed him to take his harassment campaign to new levels of psychological sophistication. Jefferson High's library was a sprawling space with high ceilings and multiple levels connected by a maze of narrow staircases and hidden alcoves. The main floor housed the circulation desk and the most popular reference materials, while the upper level contained the older books and specialized collections that most students never bothered to explore. Kendra spent her free periods and lunch breaks in the biography section on the upper level, where she could usually find complete privacy among the dusty shelves of books about historical figures and dead politicians. It was in this quiet sanctuary that she felt most like herself, surrounded by stories of people who had overcome incredible obstacles to make their mark on the world. She had read biographies of everyone from Marie Curie to Frederick Douglass, finding inspiration in their struggles and comfort in their ultimate triumphs. Blake discovered her refuge purely by accident one afternoon when he was looking for Tyler, who had been assigned to help Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, with some heavy lifting in the storage room. As Blake climbed the stairs to the upper level, he heard the soft sound of pages turning and followed it to its source. There he found Kendra, completely absorbed in a thick biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, so focused on her reading that she didn't notice his approach until he was standing directly in front of her table. "Well, well," Blake said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the library's hushed atmosphere. "Look what we have here. Little mouse girl has a secret hideout." Kendra looked up startled, her eyes wide with the panic of someone whose safe space had just been violated. She started to gather her books, clearly intending to leave, but Blake moved to block her path. "Don't go," he said, his tone mockingly hurt. "I was hoping we could finally have a real conversation. Get to know each other better. We've been going to school together for years, and I feel like I hardly know anything about you." Tyler appeared around the corner at that moment, having finished his work in the storage room. His face lit up when he saw the situation, and he quickly moved to flank Kendra's other side, effectively trapping her at the table. "This is nice," Tyler said, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "Like a little study group. What are you reading there, Kendra? Something exciting?" Kendra clutched her book to her chest and tried to squeeze past them, but Blake and Tyler had positioned themselves to make escape impossible without creating a scene that would bring unwanted attention from Mrs. Patterson downstairs. "Eleanor Roosevelt," Blake read, leaning over to see the book's cover. "Wow, that's really something. I bet she was a real inspiration to quiet girls who don't know how to stand up for themselves." The implication was clear and cutting. Blake was drawing a parallel between Kendra's passivity and what he perceived as Eleanor Roosevelt's weakness, deliberately mischaracterizing one of history's most formidable women as a fellow victim. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated cruelty that Blake specialized in, an insult that demonstrated his intelligence while revealing his fundamental ignorance. This became Blake's new favorite hunting ground. The library's multiple levels and maze-like layout provided endless opportunities for ambushes, and Mrs. Patterson was too busy managing the circulation desk to monitor what was happening in the remote corners of the building. Blake would wait until Kendra was deep in the biography section, completely absorbed in her reading, then appear around the corner with Tyler in tow, ready to transform her peaceful sanctuary into another stage for his psychological warfare. Sometimes they would simply knock books from her hands, sending her carefully organized materials scattering across the floor while making comments about her clumsiness. Other times they would engage in loud conversations about how pathetic it was that some people had no friends and had to spend their free time reading about dead people. Blake developed a particular talent for asking Kendra direct questions about her reading that were designed to humiliate her no matter how she responded. "So tell me about Eleanor Roosevelt," he would say, pulling up a chair uninvited and settling in as if he genuinely wanted to learn. "What made her so special?" I mean, she was just a president's wife, right? It's not like she accomplished anything on her own. If Kendra tried to explain Eleanor Roosevelt's actual accomplishments, her work with the United Nations, her advocacy for civil rights, her transformation of the role of First Lady, Blake would interrupt with dismissive comments about how she was just reading about other people's lives instead of living her own. If she remained silent or tried to leave, he would interpret this as proof that she didn't actually understand what she was reading and was just pretending to be smart. The gymnasium became another battleground, particularly during lunch periods when students were allowed to use the space for informal activities. Kendra had discovered that she could eat her lunch in relative peace behind the bleachers, where the shadows and support beams created a series of small, private spaces that most students ignored. She would sit on the floor with her back against the wall, her book balanced on her knees, and her lunch spread out on a napkin beside her. Blake found her there on a rainy Thursday when outdoor lunch activities had been cancelled and the gymnasium was more crowded than usual. He and Tyler had been looking for entertainment, and the sight of Kendra hiding behind the bleachers like a scared animal triggered Blake's predatory instincts. "Look at this," Blake said to Tyler, his voice loud enough to carry to other students who were shooting baskets or sitting in the regular bleacher seats. "She's literally hiding from us, like we're some kind of monsters or something." He approached Kendra's hiding spot with exaggerated caution, as if he were trying not to spook a wild animal. "Hey there, little mouse. Don't be scared. We just want to be friends." Kendra tried to stand up and leave, but Blake positioned himself to block her exit, while Tyler moved around to cut off her alternate escape route. The space behind the bleachers was narrow and confining, making it impossible for her to get past them without physical contact. "You know, it's really unhealthy to eat alone all the time," Blake continued, his voice taking on a tone of mock concern. "Social interaction is important for proper psychological development. You should come sit with us sometime." As he spoke, Blake moved closer to Kendra, using his size and proximity to make her feel trapped and uncomfortable. He had perfected this technique over years of practice, the ability to use his physical presence as a weapon without actually touching his victims, creating a sense of threat and intimidation that was difficult to describe to adults who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. "I bet your parents worry about you," Tyler added, joining Blake in creating a wall of hostile male presence that made the space feel even smaller and more confining. "I mean, if my kid was this antisocial, I'd probably think about getting professional help." The comment about her parents hit Kendra particularly hard, as Blake had intended it to. Tyler didn't know about her mother's death, but he had guessed correctly that family was a sensitive topic for her. The casual cruelty of suggesting that she needed professional help for being quiet and preferring books to socializing was designed to plant seeds of self-doubt and shame that would continue to grow long after the conversation ended. This pattern continued for weeks, with Blake and Tyler finding new ways to make Kendra's life miserable while maintaining their reputations as popular, well-liked students. They were careful to vary their tactics and locations, making sure their harassment never became predictable enough for Kendra to completely avoid. They also made sure to space out their attacks, allowing enough time between incidents that they could claim they were just having innocent fun, rather than conducting a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. But it was in the main hallway, right by the trophy case near the principal's office, where Blake's cruelty reached its most sophisticated and public heights. The morning rush between classes created the perfect audience for his performances, with hundreds of students flowing through the space in a constant stream of teenage energy and social drama. The trophy case itself served as a symbol of achievement and recognition, making it the ideal backdrop for demonstrating the difference between winners and losers, between those who mattered and those who didn't. Blake would position himself strategically near the trophy case during the busiest transitions, timing his harassment to coincide with maximum foot traffic. He had studied Kendra's schedule and knew exactly when she would need to pass through this area, and he used this knowledge to create elaborate scenarios designed to humiliate her in front of as many witnesses as possible. One morning, he stretched his leg out just as Kendra passed, sending her tumbling into a group of cheerleaders who shrieked and pushed her away like she was contaminated. The cheerleaders' reaction, their expressions of disgust and annoyance at being touched by someone so far beneath them socially, was almost as devastating as the fall itself. Blake quickly apologized to the cheerleaders for Kendra's clumsiness, positioning himself as their protector against her social awkwardness. Another time, he grabbed her backpack as she walked by, unzipping it and dumping its contents across the floor, while commenting loudly about how she probably carried around weird stuff that normal people would be embarrassed to own. Kendra's belongings, her carefully organized notebooks, her worn paperback books, her modest lunch and basic school supplies, were scattered across the hallway floor while hundreds of students stepped over and around them, too busy with their own concerns to help her gather them up. The psychological impact of these public humiliations was exactly what Blake had intended. Each incident sent a clear message to the rest of the school about Kendra's place in the social hierarchy and Blake's power to determine that place. Students who might have been inclined to be friendly toward Kendra began to distance themselves, not wanting to risk becoming targets themselves. Teachers who noticed the incidents tended to interpret them as normal teenage social dynamics rather than systematic harassment, especially since Blake was always quick to offer apologies and explanations that made him appear considerate rather than cruel. Through it all, Kendra maintained her silence, enduring each humiliation with the stoic patience of someone who had learned early that fighting back often made things worse. She had watched other students try to stand up to Blake and Tyler over the years, and she had seen how those confrontations always ended, with the victim being labeled as unstable or aggressive, while Blake and Tyler were seen as the innocent parties who had been unfairly attacked. Her father's voice echoed in her head during the worst moments. "Pick your battles, sweetheart. Some fights aren't worth winning." She would gather her books, straighten her chair, clean up whatever mess Blake had created, and continue on as if nothing had happened. But Blake seemed to take her silence as permission to escalate, interpreting her restraint as weakness rather than strength. He began to talk openly about her in front of other students, making comments about her appearance, her family situation, and her social isolation that were designed to reinforce her status as an outcast. He would speculate loudly about why she never talked to anyone, suggesting that she might have serious mental health issues or come from an abusive home situation. These comments were always phrased as expressions of concern rather than mockery, allowing Blake to maintain his image as a caring classmate while actually making Kendra's isolation worse. The campaign of harassment had been going on for 3 weeks when Blake Morrison made the decision that would change everything. He decided that Kendra Thorne needed to be taught a lesson she would never forget, and he began planning what he intended to be the ultimate demonstration of his power over her. He had no way of knowing that his carefully chosen victim possessed skills that could end his reign of terror in a matter of seconds, or that his next act of cruelty would trigger a response that would transform the entire social landscape of Jefferson High School. But Kendra knew. Deep down, beneath the careful layers of patience and restraint that she had built up over years of training and discipline, she could feel something beginning to stir. Her father had taught her to pick her battles, and Master Kim had taught her that violence should always be a last resort. But they had also both taught her that there came a time when enough was enough, when endurance became enablement, and patience became complicity in one's own destruction. Blake Morrison was about to discover that quiet little Kendra Thorne was not the helpless victim he had assumed her to be. And the lesson he was about to learn would be one he would never forget. Marcus Rivera arrived at Jefferson High School on a crisp Monday morning in early October. carrying nothing but a worn leather messenger bag and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from someone who has learned to adapt to new situations without losing their sense of self. He was 17 years old, average height with dark hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to notice everything without making judgments about what they saw. His clothes were simple but well-fitted, dark jeans, a grey Henley shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days, but were obviously well cared for. Marcus had spent his junior year at a large public high school in Riverside, California, where his father had worked as a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant that had closed down due to overseas competition. When Roberto Rivera lost his job after 15 years with the company, he had spent 6 months sending out resumes and growing increasingly frustrated with the limited opportunities available for a man in his 40s with a high school education and specialized experience in a dying industry. The job offer from Morrison Construction, Blake's father's company, had seemed like a miracle. Roberto would be managing a crew of workers at the new subdivision being built on the outskirts of Jefferson, and the pay was actually better than what he had been making in California. The small town seemed like it would be a good place to finish raising his son, somewhere with lower crime rates and stronger community values than the increasingly chaotic urban environment they were leaving behind. Marcus had mixed feelings about the move. He understood why his father needed to take the job, and he was grateful that the family would be financially stable again after months of uncertainty. But leaving California meant leaving behind his girlfriend of 8 months, his spot on the cross-country team where he had been one of the top runners, and a group of close friends he had known since middle school. Starting senior year at a new school where he knew absolutely no one felt like being asked to rebuild his entire identity from scratch. Jefferson High School was smaller than his previous school, with only about 800 students compared to the 1,500 he was used to. The building itself was older and more traditional, with long hallways lined with metal lockers and classrooms that felt cramped compared to the more modern facilities he had left behind. But there was something appealing about the school's intimate scale. It felt like a place where it might actually be possible to know most of your classmates by name, where teachers could develop real relationships with their students rather than just processing them through the academic machinery. What struck Marcus most during his first few days at Jefferson was the rigid social stratification that seemed to govern every aspect of student life. His previous school had certainly had its popular kids and outcasts, but the social boundaries had been more fluid, with multiple friend groups and subcultures that allowed for greater mobility between different circles. At Jefferson, the hierarchy seemed carved in stone, with clearly defined roles and expectations that everyone understood and accepted without question. At the top of this hierarchy was Blake Morrison, whose dominance was so complete that other students seemed to unconsciously adjust their behavior when he was around. Marcus noticed how conversations would pause when Blake entered a room, how other students would subtly rearrange themselves to either get closer to him or farther away, depending on their relationship to his inner circle. It reminded Marcus of nature documentaries about wolf packs, where every animal knew exactly where it stood in the pecking order and behaved accordingly. Blake had made an effort to be friendly to Marcus during his first week, which Marcus initially appreciated as a gesture of welcome from the school's unofficial social leader. Blake had introduced him to other popular students, invited him to sit at their lunch table, and even suggested that Marcus try out for the football team if he was interested in making new friends quickly. "New guy like you, good-looking, seems pretty cool. You could definitely find your place here," Blake had said with his trademark easy smile. "Just got to make sure you understand how things work, you know? Who to hang out with, who to avoid, that kind of thing." But as the days passed, Marcus began to pick up on the subtle undercurrents of Blake's friendliness. There was something calculating about it, as if Blake were evaluating Marcus's potential usefulness rather than offering genuine friendship. More troubling were the casual comments Blake would make about other students, dismissive observations about their clothes, their families, their perceived social awkwardness that revealed a cruel streak beneath his charming exterior. Marcus had been raised by parents who valued kindness and respect for others above social status or popularity. His father, despite working in a blue-collar job, had a quiet dignity and strong moral compass that had shaped Marcus's understanding of what it meant to be a good man. His mother, Elena, worked as a nurse at a community clinic, serving mostly low-income patients, and she had taught Marcus from an early age that every person deserved to be treated with basic human decency, regardless of their circumstances. These values put Marcus at odds with the social dynamics he observed at Jefferson High, particularly when he began to notice how Blake and his friends treated students they considered beneath them. The casual cruelty, the elaborate pranks designed to humiliate rather than amuse, the way certain students would literally flee when they saw Blake approaching. All of it made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable with his tentative acceptance into the popular crowd. It was during his second week at Jefferson that Marcus first noticed Kendra Thorne. She was sitting alone in the library during lunch period, so absorbed in her reading that she seemed completely unaware of the world around her. Marcus had been looking for a quiet place to eat his own lunch while working on a history assignment, and the sight of someone else who preferred books to the cafeteria's social battlefield immediately caught his attention. He observed her for several days before working up the courage to introduce himself. She always sat at the same table near the windows on the library's upper level, always had a thick biography or historical novel propped open beside her modest lunch, and always seemed to find genuine pleasure in whatever she was reading. There was something appealing about her complete absorption in her books, the way she would occasionally smile at something on the page or furrow her brow in concentration as she processed a particularly complex passage. Marcus also noticed that she was beautiful in a quiet, understated way that seemed designed to avoid attention rather than attract it. Her dark hair fell across her face like a protective curtain, but when she would absently tuck it behind her ear while reading, he could see the elegant line of her profile and the intelligence in her dark eyes. She dressed in oversized clothes that hid her figure, but there was something graceful about her movements, a kind of controlled precision that suggested hidden depths. More than her appearance, though, Marcus was intrigued by her obvious intelligence and the intensity of her focus. He had grown tired of conversations with his California friends about social media drama and celebrity gossip, and he found himself wondering what someone who spent her free time reading biographies of historical figures might think about more substantial topics. It took Marcus 3 days to work up the courage to approach her. He had been raised to be respectful of other people's space and privacy, and he didn't want to make assumptions about whether Kendra would welcome company or prefer to be left alone with her books. But his curiosity finally overcame his caution, and he decided to take the risk of introducing himself. "Excuse me," he said quietly, stopping near her table with his own lunch in hand. "I'm Marcus Rivera. I'm new here, and I was wondering if you might mind if I sat down. I promise I won't bother you if you prefer to read alone." Kendra looked up from her book, a biography of Frederick Douglass, with the startled expression of someone who wasn't used to being approached by classmates, especially not polite ones who asked permission before intruding on her space. For a moment, she seemed uncertain how to respond, as if she were trying to determine whether this was some kind of elaborate prank or setup. I don't mind," she said finally, her voice quiet but not unfriendly. "I mean, it's not my table or anything." Marcus sat down across from her, careful to leave plenty of space and to position himself so that he wasn't directly facing her, which might have felt too intimate or confrontational. He unpacked his lunch and opened his own book, a paperback copy of The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, without immediately trying to start a conversation. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both reading while they ate. Marcus found himself stealing glances at Kendra, noticing the way she would occasionally nod or shake her head slightly in response to whatever she was reading, as if she were having a silent conversation with Frederick Douglass himself. When she finally looked up and caught him watching her, he smiled and gestured toward her book. "How do you like it?" he asked. "I read that one last year for a project on the Civil War. Douglass was incredible. The way he taught himself to read and write, the speeches he gave. It's hard to believe one person could have such an impact on history." Kendra's eyes lit up with genuine interest, and for the first time since Marcus had been at Jefferson, he saw her smile, a real smile that transformed her entire face and revealed the intelligence and warmth that she kept so carefully hidden. "He's amazing," she agreed, her voice stronger and more confident when talking about something she was passionate about. "I love how he refused to let anyone define what he was capable of achieving. He could have been content just with gaining his own freedom, but he spent his whole life fighting for others." This led to a conversation about the Civil War, about the role of education in personal liberation, about the courage it took to stand up for principles even when doing so came at great personal cost. Marcus was impressed by Kendra's knowledge and insights, which went far beyond what most high school students would glean from casual reading. She had clearly thought deeply about the historical figures she studied, drawing connections between their struggles and broader themes about human nature and social justice. As they talked, Marcus began to understand why Kendra preferred the company of books to that of most of her classmates. She was operating on a different intellectual level than the typical Jefferson High student, more interested in ideas and principles than in the petty social dramas that consumed most teenage energy. She asked thoughtful questions about his previous school, his family's move to Jefferson, his impressions of the town and its people. When he mentioned that his mother was a nurse, she wanted to know about the clinic where she worked and the challenges of providing health care to underserved populations. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Blake Morrison and Tyler Kane, who appeared around the corner with the predatory expressions that Marcus was beginning to recognize as a bad sign. He watched as Kendra's entire demeanor changed, her shoulders hunching defensively, her eyes dropping to the table, her newfound confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Well, well," Blake said, his voice carrying easily through the library's quiet atmosphere. "Look what we have here. Little Kendra's found herself a friend. That's unexpected." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty in Blake's tone, the way he spoke about Kendra as if she was some kind of zoo animal rather than a fellow human being. He started to stand up, ready to tell Blake and Tyler to find someone else to bother, but Kendra caught his arm and shook her head slightly. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "don't make it worse." The fear in her voice told Marcus everything he needed to know about the dynamic between Kendra and Blake, and about the systematic harassment that had clearly been going on long before Marcus arrived at Jefferson. He settled back into his chair, but his jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists as Blake continued his psychological assault. "You know, Marcus," Blake said, pulling up a chair uninvited and settling in as if he had every right to join their conversation, "I should probably warn you about our friend Kendra here. She's got some issues, social anxiety, probably some other stuff too. You seem like a nice guy, and I'd hate for you to get the wrong idea about the kind of people you should be hanging out with." The calculated cruelty of this statement was breathtaking in its sophistication. Blake was simultaneously humiliating Kendra by suggesting she had mental health problems, positioning himself as Marcus's protector and guide to proper social navigation, and establishing his authority to determine who was and wasn't worthy of friendship. It was exactly the kind of multi-layered psychological warfare that Blake had perfected over years of practice. Marcus felt his anger building, but he could see the panic in Kendra's eyes and realized that any confrontation would likely make things worse for her after he was gone. So instead of responding with the anger Blake was trying to provoke, Marcus smiled calmly and looked directly into Blake's eyes. "Thanks for the concern," he said, his voice pleasant but carrying an undertone of steel. "But I'm pretty good at figuring out for myself who I want to spend time with. Kendra and I were having a really interesting conversation about Frederick Douglass. Do you know much about him? His autobiography is incredible. You should check it out sometime." The suggestion that Blake should educate himself by reading was delivered with such innocent sincerity that it was impossible to take offense. But the implication was clear. Marcus was subtly pointing out the intellectual gap between Kendra's interests and Blake's obvious lack of familiarity with serious literature, while simultaneously refusing to be drawn into Blake's attempt to establish social dominance. Blake's smile faltered slightly, and Marcus could see him struggling to find a response that would allow him to maintain control of the situation. Tyler, meanwhile, was looking back and forth between the two boys with the expression of someone who sensed conflict but wasn't quite sure how to interpret what was happening. "Right," Blake said finally, his voice losing some of its confident edge. "Well, anyway, just thought I should give you a heads up. You know, help out a fellow new guy and all that." He stood up from the table, clearly realizing that his usual tactics weren't working against Marcus's calm resistance. "Come on, Tyler. Let's leave these two to their book club." After they left, Marcus and Kendra sat in silence for several minutes. Marcus could see that the encounter had shaken her, and he waited patiently for her to regain her composure before speaking. "I'm sorry that happened," he said quietly. "How long has Blake been bothering you?" Kendra looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to recognize what had just occurred as harassment rather than normal social interaction. "A few weeks," she said finally. "It's not really a big deal. I mean, he's not wrong about me being antisocial." "There's nothing wrong with being quiet or preferring books to small talk," Marcus said firmly. "And there's definitely nothing wrong with you that gives anyone the right to treat you like that." This simple statement of support seemed to affect Kendra more than anything else Marcus could have said. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, and he realized that she probably hadn't heard anyone defend her in a very long time. They continued meeting in the library during lunch periods after that, and Marcus began to see glimpses of the person Kendra might be if she weren't constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack. She was funny when she felt safe enough to make jokes, usually dry observations about their teachers or classmates that revealed a sharp wit beneath her quiet exterior. She was incredibly well-read, with a particular passion for biographies and historical fiction that had given her insights into human nature that impressed Marcus with their sophistication. Most importantly, she was kind. When Marcus mentioned that he was struggling with the transition to a new school, she offered to help him navigate Jefferson's unwritten social rules and avoid potential pitfalls. When he told her about missing his friends and girlfriend back in California, she listened without judgment and offered thoughtful advice about maintaining long-distance relationships. She seemed genuinely interested in his experiences and opinions, asking questions that showed she was really listening rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. As their friendship developed, Marcus began to understand the full extent of Blake's harassment campaign against Kendra. She never complained directly, but he noticed the way she would flinch when footsteps approached their table, the way she would carefully time her movements between classes to avoid certain hallways, the way she would pack up her lunch and leave immediately if Blake and Tyler entered the cafeteria. Marcus also began to see how isolated Kendra had become. She had no other friends, no social connections outside of their library meetings, no participation in any extracurricular activities that might have provided her with a support network. Blake's campaign had been devastatingly effective in cutting her off from any potential allies or sources of help. This realization made Marcus angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. He had always considered himself a fairly easygoing person, slow to anger and quick to forgive. But there was something about the systematic nature of Blake's cruelty, the way he had isolated and targeted someone who was clearly no threat to him, that triggered a protective instinct Marcus hadn't known he possessed. He began to position himself as a buffer between Kendra and her tormentors whenever possible. When he saw Blake and Tyler approaching the library, he would casually suggest that he and Kendra move to a different section or go outside for fresh air. When Blake made one of his calculated comments about Kendra in Marcus's presence, Marcus would respond with calm questions that forced Blake to either explain his cruelty or back down from it. But Marcus also realized that his presence could only provide temporary protection. He was new to the school and still figuring out his own place in the social hierarchy. More importantly, he could see that Kendra needed to find her own way to deal with Blake's harassment rather than relying on someone else to rescue her. What Marcus didn't know was that Kendra was beginning to reach the same conclusion. Their friendship had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing, a reminder that she was worth defending, that her thoughts and feelings mattered, that she deserved to be treated with basic human respect. For the first time in months, she was remembering who she had been before Blake's campaign began, and she was starting to wonder if that person might still exist somewhere beneath the layers of fear and isolation she had accumulated. The friendship between Marcus and Kendra was about to become the catalyst for a confrontation that would change everything at Jefferson High School. Blake Morrison had built his reputation on his ability to identify and exploit weakness, but he was about to discover that what he had mistaken for weakness was actually strength held in careful reserve, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone could have predicted. Thursday, October 24th, dawned grey and overcast, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised rain before the day was over. Kendra woke up that morning with an unusual sense of anticipation, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. She had been looking forward to this day for weeks, and as she stood in front of her bedroom mirror brushing her hair, she found herself thinking about the afternoon ahead with something that felt almost like excitement. The reason for her anticipation was simple. She and Marcus had arranged to meet in the library after school to work on their Civil War project, just as they had been doing for the past several weeks. What made this day different was that they were finally ready to begin putting together their presentation, which meant they would be spending several hours working closely together, sharing ideas, and building something meaningful from all the research they had accumulated. Over the past month, their partnership had evolved from a simple academic arrangement into something much more significant. Marcus had a way of listening that made Kendra feel like her thoughts and insights actually mattered, and his questions pushed her to think more deeply about the historical events they were studying. More than that, he had become a friend, the first real friend she had made since starting high school 3 years ago. As she got dressed for school, Kendra made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of reaching for one of her usual oversized flannel shirts, she pulled out a soft blue sweater that her aunt had given her for Christmas the previous year. The sweater was more fitted than her usual clothes, made of a cashmere blend that felt luxurious against her skin, and the color brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. She had never worn it to school before, partly because it seemed too nice for everyday use, and partly because she was afraid it might draw unwanted attention. But today felt different. Today, she wanted to look nice, not to impress anyone, but because she was tired of hiding behind shapeless clothes and defensive postures. Marcus had shown her that she was worth talking to, worth listening to, worth treating with respect and kindness. Maybe it was time to start believing that herself. The morning passed uneventfully, with Kendra moving through her classes with the careful routine she had perfected over years of trying to remain invisible. But she noticed that the blue sweater did attract some attention, not the cruel, mocking attention that Blake and Tyler usually directed her way, but the kind of positive notice that suggested her classmates were seeing her as an actual person rather than just background scenery. In her AP English class, Mrs. Rodriguez complimented her on the sweater and mentioned that the color looked lovely on her. During chemistry lab, her usually silent lab partner actually initiated a conversation about their experiment, and Kendra found herself responding with more confidence than she had felt in months. Even in the hallways, she noticed that some students were making eye contact and nodding hello, as if her slightly more confident appearance had made her visible to them for the first time. Blake Morrison noticed the change too, though his interpretation of it was characteristically self-centered and malicious. When he saw Kendra walking to her locker before lunch, he immediately zeroed in on the blue sweater and what it might represent. "Well, well," he said to Tyler as they watched her work her combination lock. "Looks like our little mouse is trying to dress up for someone. You think maybe she's got a crush on that new kid from California?" Tyler grinned with the anticipation of fresh ammunition for their ongoing harassment campaign. "That would be hilarious. Can you imagine? Little Kendra thinking someone like Marcus would actually be interested in her." Blake's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed Marcus and Kendra spending time together in the library, and it had irritated him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Part of it was simple territoriality. Marcus was supposed to be integrating into Blake's social circle, not forming independent friendships with social outcasts. But there was something else bothering Blake, something that felt almost like jealousy. Marcus Rivera had something that Blake desperately wanted but could never quite achieve: genuine confidence. Where Blake's swagger was built on the constant need to prove his superiority over others, Marcus seemed comfortable with himself in a way that didn't require putting anyone else down. He was friendly without being desperate for approval, intelligent without being arrogant, and attractive without seeming to work at it. More troubling for Blake was the way other students responded to Marcus. The popular kids liked him because he was cool and confident, but he also got along easily with the academic achievers, the athletes from other sports, and even some of the social outcasts that Blake and his friends usually ignored or tormented. Marcus seemed to move effortlessly between different social groups without losing status in any of them, which was exactly the kind of natural charisma that Blake had always envied in others. The fact that Marcus had chosen to befriend Kendra Thorne felt like a personal insult to Blake's worldview. In Blake's understanding of high school social dynamics, popular people like Marcus were supposed to associate only with other popular people, maintaining clear boundaries between the worthy and the unworthy. Marcus's friendship with Kendra suggested that he either didn't understand these rules or didn't care about them, both of which threatened the entire system that Blake used to maintain his position at the top of the hierarchy. "I think it's time we taught both of them a lesson," Blake said to Tyler, his voice taking on the cold, calculating tone that usually preceded his most elaborate schemes. "Little Kendra needs to understand her place, and Marcus needs to learn about the consequences of making poor social choices." Tyler's grin widened. He had been hoping for weeks that Blake would decide to escalate their campaign against Kendra, and the addition of Marcus as a secondary target made the prospect even more appealing. "What did you have in mind?" "Meet me in the library after school," Blake said. "I want to catch them during one of their little study sessions. It's time for Marcus to see exactly what kind of person he's been wasting his time with." Blake spent the rest of the day refining his plan, which was designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. He would humiliate Kendra in front of Marcus, demonstrating her powerlessness and social insignificance. He would force Marcus to choose between defending Kendra and preserving his own social standing, testing whether his friendship with her was strong enough to withstand public embarrassment. And he would remind everyone who might be watching that Blake Morrison was still the undisputed king of Jefferson High School, capable of destroying anyone who challenged his authority. The beauty of the plan was its calculated escalation. Blake intended to start with verbal harassment, pushing Kendra's buttons until she either broke down or tried to fight back. If she broke down, he would have demonstrated her weakness to Marcus and established his own dominance. If she tried to fight back, he would escalate to physical intimidation, using his size and Tyler's presence to make her feel helpless and afraid. The centerpiece of his strategy was a move he had been saving for just the right moment. Something that would be so humiliating and shocking that it would forever change how everyone at school thought about Kendra Thorne. He planned to grab her shirt and pull it up in front of Marcus and anyone else who might be watching, exposing her and making her feel vulnerable and ashamed. It would be the kind of sexual humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her high school career, marking her as not just a social outcast, but as someone who had been publicly violated and degraded. Blake was confident that this plan would work because it always had before. In his experience, victims of systematic harassment were broken down gradually, their confidence and resistance worn away by months of smaller humiliations until they were incapable of defending themselves when faced with a major assault. Kendra had endured weeks of his psychological warfare without fighting back, which Blake interpreted as proof that she was fundamentally weak and submissive. What Blake didn't know was that Kendra's restraint had nothing to do with weakness, and everything to do with discipline, training, and a deeply held belief that violence should always be a last resort. He had no idea that every evening after school, while he was hanging out with his friends or playing video games, Kendra was in Master Kim's studio practicing techniques that could incapacitate an attacker in seconds. He couldn't have imagined that beneath her quiet exterior lay years of martial arts training, 3 regional tournament victories, and the kind of physical conditioning that came from 6 years of dedicated practice. Most crucially, Blake had no understanding of the philosophical framework that governed Kendra's approach to conflict. Master Kim had taught her that true martial artists used their skills only when all other options had been exhausted, and only with the minimum force necessary to end a threat. But he had also taught her that there came a point when endurance became enablement, when allowing someone to hurt you actually encouraged them to hurt others. Kendra had been approaching that point for weeks, and Blake Morrison was about to push her past it. The school day ended with Kendra feeling more optimistic than she had in months. Her presentation of a report on Reconstruction policies in her AP history class had gone particularly well, with Mr. Thompson praising her insights and several classmates asking thoughtful follow-up questions. For once, she felt like she was being seen and appreciated for her intelligence rather than dismissed or ignored. As she made her way to the library, Kendra found herself looking forward to the afternoon ahead. She and Marcus had developed an easy working relationship that had gradually evolved into genuine friendship, and she was excited to show him the visual aids she had created for their presentation. She had spent hours the previous evening creating a detailed timeline of key Civil War battles and political developments, illustrated with maps and photographs that she had carefully selected and arranged. The library was quieter than usual that afternoon, with most students having already left for the day or moved on to after-school activities. Mrs. Patterson was working at the circulation desk, processing returned books and preparing for the next day, while a handful of students were scattered throughout the main floor, working on homework or research projects. Kendra climbed the stairs to the upper level, where she and Marcus always met for their project sessions. She chose their usual table near the windows, where the afternoon light was best for reading, and the location provided enough privacy for serious conversation without complete isolation from the rest of the library. She spread out their materials systematically: her timeline, Marcus's research notes, their shared outline, and the books they had been using as sources. As she arranged their workspace, Kendra found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since Marcus's arrival at Jefferson High. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to each day, someone who valued her thoughts and opinions, someone who made her feel like she mattered. The friendship had given her a glimpse of who she might be if she weren't constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack from Blake and Tyler. She was so absorbed in her preparations that she didn't notice Blake and Tyler's arrival until they were already climbing the stairs to the upper level. The sound of their voices, Blake's confident baritone and Tyler's harsh laugh, sent a familiar chill down her spine and made her stomach clench with anticipation of whatever humiliation they had planned for her today. "Well, well," Blake said, as he rounded the corner and spotted her at the table. "Look what we have here. Little Kendra all dressed up and waiting for her boyfriend. That's sweet." Kendra's heart sank as she realized that Marcus hadn't arrived yet, which meant she would have to face Blake and Tyler alone. She started gathering her materials, hoping to escape before the situation escalated, but Blake quickly moved to block her path, while Tyler positioned himself on her other side. "Don't go," Blake said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of false friendliness that she had learned to fear. "We were hoping to have a little chat with you. You know, clear the air about some things." Tyler grinned and pulled up a chair, settling in as if he were joining a friendly conversation rather than participating in a planned assault. "Yeah, we're curious about this whole transformation thing you've got going on. New clothes, new attitude. It's like you're trying to be a different person or something." Blake circled around to stand behind Kendra's chair, using his height and proximity to make her feel trapped and intimidated. "You know what I think, Tyler? I think our little friend here has gotten some ideas above her station. I think she's forgotten where she belongs in the grand scheme of things." As he spoke, Blake moved closer to Kendra, letting his presence serve as a silent threat. He had perfected this technique over years of practice, the ability to use his physical size and aggressive energy to make his victims feel helpless without actually touching them. It was a form of psychological warfare that was difficult to describe to adults who hadn't witnessed it firsthand, which made it perfect for his purposes. "I bet she thinks that new kid from California actually likes her," Tyler added, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Like, actually likes her, not just feels sorry for her, or is being nice because his parents taught him to be polite to the less fortunate." The cruelty of this observation was precisely calibrated to hit Kendra, where it would hurt most. Blake and Tyler had correctly identified her growing friendship with Marcus as the source of her recent confidence, and they were systematically attacking the foundation of that relationship by suggesting it was based on pity rather than genuine affection. "That's got to be it," Blake agreed, moving even closer to Kendra's chair. "Poor Marcus probably doesn't realize what he's gotten himself into. Someone should really warn him about the kind of person he's been hanging out with." Kendra tried to stand up and leave, but Blake put his hand on the back of her chair, effectively trapping her in place. The gesture was subtle enough that it wouldn't look threatening to a casual observer, but the message was clear. She wasn't going anywhere until Blake decided the conversation was over. "I mean, look at her," Tyler continued, his voice growing louder and more confident as he warmed to his theme. "Sitting here all alone, waiting for someone who probably forgot all about their little study date. It's actually kind of pathetic when you think about it." This was the moment when everything changed, though none of them realized it yet. Marcus Rivera appeared at the top of the stairs, taking in the scene with growing anger and recognition. He could see Kendra trapped between Blake and Tyler, could see the fear in her posture and the cruel satisfaction in their faces, could understand immediately what was happening, even if he hadn't heard their specific words. Marcus had been delayed by a conversation with his chemistry teacher about an upcoming lab assignment, and he was already feeling guilty about being late for their study session. The sight of Blake and Tyler harassing Kendra in his absence triggered a protective rage that surprised him with its intensity. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of warning as he approached their table. "Is there a problem here?" Blake's grin widened as he turned to face Marcus, clearly pleased that his primary target had finally arrived. "Oh, look who it is, the knight in shining armor. No problem at all, California. Just having a friendly conversation with our mutual friend here." Marcus stepped closer, his jaw set and his hands clenched into fists. "Looks like you're bothering her. Maybe you should find somewhere else to hang out." The confrontation that followed would become the stuff of Jefferson High School legend, though the details would be exaggerated and distorted with each retelling. What actually happened was far more significant than anyone who witnessed it could have realized at the time. It was the moment when Blake Morrison's carefully constructed kingdom began to crumble, and when Kendra Thorne finally found the courage to reclaim her power. "Marcus, it's okay," Kendra said quietly, though her voice was trembling with suppressed emotion. "Really, it's fine." But it wasn't fine, and everyone in that moment knew it. Blake had pushed the situation past the point where it could be resolved with words or diplomatic retreats. He had committed himself to a course of action that would either establish his dominance definitively or reveal the fundamental weakness that lay beneath his carefully constructed persona. "You know what, California?" Blake said, stepping closer to Marcus with the confidence of someone who had never lost a confrontation. "I don't think you understand how things work around here. See, Kendra and we have an arrangement. She knows her place, and I remind her of it when she forgets. And right now, she's forgotten. What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. A single moment of shocking cruelty that crossed every line of decency and human respect that had previously governed even Blake's worst behavior. In one swift motion, Blake reached down and grabbed the bottom of Kendra's soft blue sweater, yanking it upward with enough force to stretch and tear the delicate fabric. The cashmere blend that had felt so luxurious that morning became a weapon of humiliation as Blake pulled it up, exposing Kendra's stomach and the plain white bra she wore underneath. "Look at that," Blake said, his voice filled with mock concern as he held the sweater in place, preventing Kendra from pulling it back down. "Little Kendra's not so mysterious after all. What do you think, California? Still want to be her hero?" The library erupted in gasps and nervous laughter from the few students who were scattered throughout the space. Several pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen that they would want to record and share. Mrs. Patterson stood up behind the circulation desk on the main floor, but she seemed frozen by the suddenness and unexpected nature of what was happening. Marcus's face went completely white, then red with a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. The casual sexual assault he had just witnessed, because that's what it was, regardless of Blake's intentions or justifications, triggered every protective instinct he possessed. "Let her go," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet with the kind of controlled fury that was far more threatening than shouting would have been. "Or what?" Blake taunted, giving Kendra's sweater another yank for emphasis. "You gonna make me?" And that's when something inside Kendra Thorne finally snapped. 6 years of training, 6 years of discipline, 6 years of holding back, of choosing patience over action, of enduring rather than fighting back. 6 years of Master Kim's teachings about responsibility and restraint, of her father's advice to pick her battles carefully, of her own deep-seated belief that violence should always be a last resort. All of it went out the window In that single moment of violation and humiliation, Blake Morrison had finally crossed the line that could never be uncrossed. He had not just embarrassed her or made her feel small, he had physically assaulted her, had exposed her body without her consent, had violated her in a way that transcended mere bullying and entered the realm of sexual predation. He had done it in front of Marcus, the one person whose opinion mattered to her, and in front of classmates who were recording it for posterity and entertainment. But most importantly, he had made her feel helpless, and Kendra Thorne was not helpless. She never had been. Her right hand shot up with the speed and precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours practicing the exact motion, her fingers closing around Blake's wrist with a grip that made him gasp in shock and sudden pain. The technique was basic Aikido, one of the first things Master Kim had taught her years ago, how to break someone's grip using leverage and proper body mechanics rather than brute strength. In one fluid motion, she twisted Blake's arm away from her body, applying pressure to specific points on his wrist and forearm that sent signals of pain and submission racing through his nervous system. Blake yelped and stumbled backward, his cocky grin replaced by an expression of shock and genuine fear as he realized that something fundamental had just changed in their relationship. "Don't," Kendra said, her voice carrying a tone that no one at Jefferson High School had ever heard before. Calm, controlled, and absolutely implacable. "Ever touch me again." She stood up slowly, pulling her sweater back into place with her free hand while maintaining her grip on Blake's wrist. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, with the kind of fluid precision that spoke of years of training and absolute confidence in her physical capabilities. Blake tried to pull away, but Kendra's grip was like iron. The pain in his wrist was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not just physical discomfort, but a kind of paralyzing agony that seemed to short-circuit his ability to think clearly. For the first time in his life, Blake Morrison was completely at someone else's mercy, and that someone was the girl he had spent weeks trying to break. "What the hell?" Blake sputtered, his voice high and strained with pain and bewilderment. "You crazy?" He reached for her with his free hand, probably intending to grab her by the shoulders and show everyone that her little move had been a fluke, that he was still in control of the situation. But Kendra was ready this time. She caught his wrist again, this time twisting it behind his back in a move that sent him to his knees on the library floor with a cry of shocked pain. "I said don't touch me," she repeated, her voice still eerily calm despite the violence of her actions. The library was completely silent now, the normal sounds of studying and quiet conversation replaced by a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Even the students who had been taking pictures had lowered their phones, too shocked by what they were witnessing to keep recording. Mrs. Patterson was standing behind her desk with her mouth hanging open, and Marcus was staring at Kendra like he had never seen her before. Because in many ways, he hadn't. The girl who had spent weeks hiding behind oversized clothes and defensive postures was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the confidence and precision of a trained fighter. The quiet student who had endured harassment without complaint had transformed into someone who radiated controlled power and absolute self-assurance. Blake tried to struggle against her grip, but years of football and weight training were useless against Kendra's superior technique and positioning. She had control of his wrist and shoulder, could manipulate his entire body by applying pressure to specific points, and had the advantage of years of grappling practice against opponents who were bigger and stronger than Blake Morrison. "Let me go," Blake hissed, his voice strained with pain and humiliation. "Are you going to behave yourself?" Kendra asked, her tone almost conversational despite the fact that she had the school's most feared bully completely helpless on the library floor. "Tyler, do something," Blake snapped at his friend, who had been standing frozen in shock since the confrontation began. But Tyler was backing away, his usual swagger completely gone. He had seen the speed and precision of Kendra's movements, had recognized something dangerous and competent in her sudden transformation. The quiet girl they had been tormenting for weeks had just demonstrated skills that made it clear she could hurt him badly if she chose to, and Tyler wasn't nearly brave enough to test whether she would make that choice. "I asked you a question," Kendra said, applying just a little more pressure to Blake's wrist to emphasize her point. "Are you going to behave yourself?" "Yes," Blake gasped, his voice cracking with pain and desperate humiliation. "Jesus, yes, just let me go." Kendra released him and stepped back, her hands loose at her sides, but ready to move again if necessary. Blake scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage as he looked around the library and took in the stares of his classmates, the shocked expression of the librarian, the way Tyler was still backing away from him like he might be contagious. "This isn't over," Blake said, but his voice was shaking with anger and something that might have been fear. "Yes," Kendra said quietly, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that held no trace of the fear or submission he was used to seeing there. "It is." Something in her tone, in the way she stood, in the complete absence of uncertainty in her voice, made Blake take an involuntary step backward. For the first time in his life, he was looking at someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who had just demonstrated that she could hurt him badly if she chose to, someone who had publicly humiliated him in front of the very audience he used to establish his dominance. The realization was written all over his face, visible to everyone who was watching. Blake Morrison's reign of terror at Jefferson High School was over, and everyone knew it. "You're crazy," Blake muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice, no real threat in his posture. "Maybe," Kendra agreed, her tone thoughtful rather than defensive, "but I'm not helpless." Blake looked around the library one more time, taking in the faces of his classmates. Some looked shocked, others seemed almost relieved, but none of them looked at him with the same mixture of fear and respect they had shown before. His kingdom was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Come on, Tyler," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. But Tyler was already gone, having slipped out during the confrontation. Blake was alone, facing down the girl he had spent weeks tormenting, and losing decisively in front of an audience that would spread the story throughout the school by morning. He turned and walked out of the library, trying to maintain some semblance of his usual swagger, but failing completely. Everyone could see that something fundamental had changed, that the confident, intimidating figure who had ruled Jefferson High School through fear and manipulation had been revealed as just another bully who crumbled when faced with real opposition. The library remained silent for a long moment after Blake left. Then, slowly, the normal sounds of studying and conversation resumed, though the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Word would spread quickly through Jefferson High School, and by morning, everyone would know that Blake Morrison had been taken down by quiet little Kendra Thorne. But in that moment, in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, there was only Marcus and Kendra, standing in the sudden quiet of the library's upper level, both of them processing what had just happened and what it meant for everything that would come after. Marcus was the first to break the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern and something that might have been awe. Kendra looked at him, suddenly aware of how she must appear, hair disheveled, sweater wrinkled, standing in the middle of the library like some kind of warrior who had just won an unexpected battle. For the first time in weeks, she was exactly where she wanted to be, standing up for herself, refusing to be a victim, claiming her right to exist in the world without fear or apology. "I'm fine," she said, and for the first time in months, she actually meant it. The transformation was immediate and profound, rippling through Jefferson High School like a stone thrown into still water. By the time Kendra and Marcus finished their project session in the library that afternoon, Working together with a new dynamic of mutual respect and understanding, word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the interconnected networks of teenage communication that operated faster than any official news service. Sarah Chen, Ashley's younger sister, had been one of the students in the library when the incident occurred. She had watched in stunned silence as quiet, invisible Kendra Thorne had systematically dismantled Blake Morrison's carefully constructed image of invincibility. Within minutes of Blake's humiliating retreat, Sarah was texting her friends with a breathless account of what she had witnessed, each retelling adding new details and emphasis to the already dramatic events. By dinner time that evening, the story had spread to parents, older siblings who had graduated from Jefferson, and even some of the teachers who monitored student social media accounts to stay informed about potential problems brewing in their classrooms. The basic facts remained consistent across all versions. Blake Morrison, the undisputed king of Jefferson High School, had been publicly humiliated and physically dominated by Kendra Thorne, a girl most students barely remembered existed. Robert Thorne was working late at the auto shop that Thursday evening, trying to finish a complicated transmission repair that had been giving him trouble all week, when his phone buzzed with a text message from Kendra. "Hey Dad, can we talk when you get home? Something happened at school today, nothing bad, just different." The carefully neutral tone of the message immediately set off alarm bells in Robert's mind. He had been waiting for years for the other shoe to drop, for his daughter's carefully maintained composure to finally crack under the pressure of adolescent social warfare. He had seen what happened to sensitive kids who were targeted by bullies, had heard too many stories about depression, self-harm, and worse outcomes for teenagers who felt trapped and helpless. Robert abandoned his transmission repair and drove home with a growing sense of dread, imagining all the possible scenarios that might require a serious conversation. He found Kendra in the kitchen, sitting at their small table with her homework spread out in front of her, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just experienced something different at school. "What's going on, sweetheart?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with the patient attention of a father who was prepared for anything. Kendra looked up from her calculus homework and smiled, a real smile that Robert hadn't seen on her face in months. "I stood up for myself today, Dad. Really stood up for myself." Over the next hour, Kendra told her father everything. About Blake Morrison's escalating harassment campaign, about the systematic humiliation she had endured for weeks, about the library confrontation and her decision to finally use the skills he had insisted she learn 6 years ago. She spoke calmly and clearly, with none of the emotional upheaval Robert had been expecting, describing the incident as a turning point rather than a crisis. Robert listened without interrupting, his expressions cycling through anger, pride, concern, and finally a kind of grim satisfaction. When Kendra finished her account, he sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she had told him and thinking about its implications for her future at Jefferson High School. "How do you feel about what happened?" he asked finally. "Free," Kendra said without hesitation. "Like I can finally breathe again. Like I don't have to spend every day looking over my shoulder waiting for the next attack." Robert nodded slowly. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. You tried every other option first. You ignored him, you avoided him, you endured his harassment without fighting back. But when he put his hands on you," his jaw tightened as he thought about Blake Morrison grabbing his daughter's shirt. "When he touched you without permission, when he tried to humiliate you like that, you had every right to defend yourself." "Master Kim always said that violence should be the last resort," Kendra said. "But he also said that there comes a point when not fighting back actually enables the aggressor to hurt other people. I think I reached that point today." "You definitely reached that point," Robert agreed. "And from what you've told me, you handled it perfectly. You used exactly as much force as necessary to stop the immediate threat, and no more. You didn't lose control, You didn't seriously injure him, and you made it clear that the harassment was over. I'm proud of you." The conversation with her father gave Kendra the confidence she needed to face whatever consequences might await her at school the next morning. She had been worried that her actions might somehow get her in trouble with the administration, or that Blake's parents might demand some kind of punishment for their son's humiliation. But Robert's approval and support reminded her that she had done nothing wrong, that defending herself against sexual assault was not just her right, but her responsibility. That same evening, Blake Morrison was having a very different conversation with his own father. Richard Morrison had received a call from Mrs. Patterson, who felt obligated to inform parents when physical altercations occurred in her library, even when those altercations were brief and resulted in no serious injuries. Her account of the incident was factual and neutral, but the implications were devastating for a family that had built its reputation on Blake's success and popularity. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet as he faced his son across the desk in his home office. "You grabbed a girl's shirt and pulled it up in front of other students. Is that an accurate description of what happened?" Blake slouched in his chair, his usual confidence completely absent. "It wasn't like that, Dad. I was just messing around, you know, just trying to put her in her place. She's been acting all weird lately, hanging out with this new kid, thinking she's something special." "You grabbed a girl's shirt," Richard repeated, his voice growing colder. "You exposed her in front of other students. Do you have any idea what that could be called, Blake? Do you understand the legal implications of what you did?" The truth was beginning to sink in for Blake, though he was still struggling to accept it. In his mind, what had happened in the library was just an escalation of his normal harassment tactics, a slightly more aggressive version of the psychological warfare he had been waging against Kendra for weeks. He hadn't thought of it as sexual assault, hadn't considered that grabbing someone's clothing without permission could have serious legal consequences. "She overreacted," Blake said weakly. "She could have seriously hurt me. Did you see my wrist? It's still sore from where she grabbed it." Richard Morrison looked at his son with a mixture of disappointment and disgust that Blake had never seen before. "She defended herself against a sexual assault, Blake. That's not an overreaction. That's exactly what she should have done. And the fact that she was able to hurt you suggests that you picked on the wrong person." "I didn't sexually assault anyone," Blake protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "What would you call it?" Richard asked. "You physically grabbed a girl's clothing and exposed her body against her will. You did it intentionally in public to humiliate and degrade her. If she or her family decides to press charges, you could be looking at criminal charges for sexual assault, not to mention a civil lawsuit that could destroy this family's reputation and financial security." The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard Morrison laying out the potential consequences of his son's actions in excruciating detail. Beyond the legal ramifications, there were social and academic consequences to consider. Blake's behavior had been witnessed by multiple students, recorded on several phones, and would inevitably be discussed throughout the school and broader community. His chances of receiving athletic scholarships or college recommendations had probably been permanently damaged, and his father's business could suffer if customers decided they didn't want to associate with a family that raised sexually aggressive young men. But perhaps most devastating for Blake was the realization that his carefully constructed image was completely shattered. The confident, charismatic leader who had ruled Jefferson High School through a combination of charm and intimidation was gone, replaced by a bully who had been publicly humiliated by one of his victims. There was no coming back from that kind of social destruction, no way to rebuild the mystique that had made him untouchable. Tyler Kane was having his own reckoning that evening, though his was more instinctive than analytical. He had recognized immediately that Blake's defeat meant the end of their partnership and his own protection from retaliation. Without Blake's leadership and social status, Tyler was just another mean kid with limited intelligence and fewer social skills. Worse, he was a mean kid who had participated in the systematic harassment of someone who had just demonstrated the ability to inflict serious physical consequences. Tyler's response was simple and cowardly. He decided to distance himself from Blake as quickly and completely as possible. That evening, he began reaching out to other students, trying to position himself as someone who had been reluctantly dragged along by Blake's schemes rather than an enthusiastic participant. He told anyone who would listen that he had always felt uncomfortable with Blake's treatment of Kendra, that he had tried to talk his friend out of escalating the harassment, that he was actually relieved that someone had finally stood up to Blake's bullying. None of these claims were true, but Tyler was betting that the social chaos following Blake's downfall would provide enough cover for him to reinvent his own narrative. He was wrong about that, as he would discover over the coming weeks, but his immediate priority was self-preservation rather than accuracy. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually filled Kendra with energy and optimism. But this particular Friday felt different from any morning she had experienced in years. As she got dressed for school, choosing a simple green sweater and her favorite jeans, she felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. For the first time since starting high school, she was actually looking forward to walking through Jefferson's hallways. The change was apparent from the moment she stepped through the school's front doors. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible were now making direct eye contact, some nodding respectfully, others offering tentative smiles. The conversations that had always stopped when she approached now continued naturally, as if she had finally been granted full membership in the human race. Her first class was AP English with Mrs. Rodriguez, and Kendra found herself participating in the discussion about The Great Gatsby with a confidence she had never felt before. When she made an observation about the symbolic significance of the green light, other students actually listened and built on her ideas rather than dismissing them or ignoring them entirely. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the change immediately, commenting after class that Kendra seemed more engaged and confident than she had all semester. But it was during the transition between classes that the full extent of the transformation became clear. As Kendra walked through the main hallway, the same corridor where Blake had staged so many of his public humiliations, students stepped aside to let her pass, not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect she had never experienced before. Some even offered quiet words of support or encouragement, letting her know that they had been rooting for her all along, but hadn't known how to help. "Hey, Kendra," said Jessica Martinez, a girl from her chemistry class who had never spoken to her before. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Good for you. Blake Morrison is a total creep, and somebody needed to put him in his place." Similar conversations followed throughout the morning, with students who had witnessed Blake's harassment campaign expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to him. Many admitted that they had wanted to intervene, but hadn't known how, or had been afraid of becoming targets themselves. Kendra's actions had apparently inspired a collective exhale of relief from students who had been living under Blake's regime of casual cruelty. The most surprising conversation came from Ashley Chen, Blake's now former girlfriend, who approached Kendra near her locker during the break between second and third period. Ashley was everything that Kendra was not: beautiful, popular, confident, and socially connected. But her expression was thoughtful rather than hostile as she waited for Kendra to finish organizing her books. "I wanted to talk to you about Blake," Ashley said without preamble, "about what happened yesterday and about other things." Kendra closed her locker and turned to face Ashley, uncertain what to expect from this conversation. In her experience, popular girls like Ashley only acknowledged her existence when they needed something or wanted to deliver some kind of social punishment. "I broke up with Blake last night," Ashley continued, her voice quiet but firm. "After I heard about what he did to you in the library. What he's been doing to you for weeks, actually. I had no idea he was capable of that." The admission seemed to cost Ashley something, as if acknowledging Blake's true nature reflected poorly on her own judgment. "I mean, I knew he could be mean sometimes, especially to kids he thought were beneath him. But I told myself it was just typical guy stuff, you know, boys being boys, that kind of garbage. I didn't realize how cruel he was actually being." Kendra didn't know how to respond to this unexpected confession. Part of her wanted to point out that Ashley's willful blindness had enabled Blake's behavior, that popular students like her had a responsibility to use their social influence to stop bullying rather than ignoring it. But another part of her recognized the courage it must have taken for Ashley to admit her mistakes and take action to correct them. "I'm sorry," Ashley said, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. "I should have done something sooner. I should have told him to stop, or reported him to the administration, or something. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my cowardice." The apology was unexpected and genuine, and it gave Kendra a glimpse into the complex social pressures that governed even the most popular students' behavior. Ashley's position at the top of the hierarchy hadn't protected her from having to make difficult moral choices, and she was clearly struggling with the realization that she had chosen social convenience over basic human decency. "Thank you for saying that," Kendra said finally. "It means more than you probably realize." They parted ways after that brief conversation, but the interaction left Kendra with a new understanding of how her actions had affected not just Blake and Tyler, but the entire social ecosystem of Jefferson High School. By refusing to remain a victim, by demonstrating that bullies could be defeated, she had apparently given other students permission to re-evaluate their own relationships and moral choices. The lunch period provided the most dramatic evidence of how completely the social landscape had shifted. Kendra approached the cafeteria with some trepidation, remembering all the times Blake had used the crowded space to stage his most public humiliations. But instead of the usual careful navigation required to avoid hostile encounters, she found herself genuinely welcomed by several different groups of students. Marcus was waiting for her at a table near the windows, not one of the prime social real estate locations, but not relegated to the outcast's corner either. He'd been joined by 3 other students: David Park, a quiet kid from their AP history class who was known for his academic achievements rather than his social connections; Emma Thompson, a sophomore who played violin in the school orchestra; and surprisingly, Tyler's former girlfriend Madison Wells, who had apparently decided that her social future lay in distancing herself from Tyler's now toxic reputation. "How's your first day as Jefferson High's newest legend going?" Marcus asked with a grin as Kendra sat down with her lunch. "It's different," Kendra admitted. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me it was all a dream and I need to go back to hiding in corners." "Trust me, it wasn't a dream," David said, pulling out his phone. "My sister was in the library yesterday when it happened. She filmed part of it before Mrs. Patterson made everyone put their phones away. Want to see?" Kendra shook her head quickly. "I think I'll pass on reliving that particular moment." "Probably wise," Emma agreed. "But you should know that the video is all over social media, and the comments are about 90% supportive of you. Apparently, Blake Morrison made a lot more enemies than friends over the years." The conversation continued throughout lunch, with each member of the group sharing their own experiences with Blake's harassment or their observations of his treatment of other students. What emerged was a picture of systematic bullying that had affected far more people than Kendra had realized, creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had poisoned the social environment for anyone who didn't fit Blake's narrow definition of acceptable. "The crazy thing is," Madison said, picking at her salad, "I always knew Blake was mean to certain people, but I told myself it wasn't really my business. Like if they couldn't stand up for themselves, maybe they deserved whatever they got. God, that sounds horrible now that I say it out loud." "It doesn't sound horrible," Kendra said. "It sounds human. It's easy to rationalize other people's suffering when stopping it would require you to risk something you value." "Still," Madison insisted, "I should have done something." "We all should have done something. The fact that it took you getting physically assaulted before anyone stood up to him, that says something pretty awful about the rest of us." This theme of collective responsibility and moral awakening ran through many of Kendra's interactions that day. Students who had previously considered themselves bystanders were grappling with their own complicity in Blake's reign of terror, while others were finding the courage to share their own experiences of harassment and intimidation. Kendra's actions had apparently opened a floodgate of suppressed emotions and delayed reckonings that went far beyond her individual situation. The most significant conversation of the day came during her last period, when Mr. Thompson asked her to stay after AP history class for a private discussion. Kendra's initial worry was that she might be in trouble for the library incident, despite her father's reassurances that she had acted appropriately in defending herself. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened yesterday," Mr. Thompson said, settling behind his desk as the other students filed out of the classroom. "But probably not for the reasons you're expecting." Mr. Thompson was in his early 30s, a relatively new teacher who had joined Jefferson's faculty 3 years ago after completing his master's degree in education. He was known for his engaging teaching style and his genuine concern for student welfare, and he had a reputation for being someone students could trust with sensitive problems. "I've been teaching here for 3 years," he continued, "and in that time, I've watched Blake Morrison use his social position to make life miserable for students who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. I've seen kids transfer schools, develop anxiety disorders, and completely withdraw from academic and social activities because of his systematic harassment." Kendra shifted uncomfortably in her chair, wondering where this conversation was heading. "The problem is," Mr. Thompson continued, "harassment like Blake's is often subtle and difficult to prove. It happens in hallways between classes, in social spaces where teachers aren't present, in ways that can be dismissed as normal teenage social dynamics. By the time adults become aware of the pattern, the damage has usually already been done." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "What you did yesterday, standing up for yourself, demonstrating that Blake's victims aren't helpless, that sent a message that goes far beyond your individual situation. You showed other students that bullies can be defeated, that they don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from someone popular or powerful." "I wasn't trying to send a message," Kendra said. "I was just trying to make him stop touching me." "I know," Mr. Thompson said with a slight smile. "That's part of what makes it so powerful. You weren't grandstanding or trying to be a hero. You were just refusing to be a victim. Sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing a person can do." He went on to explain that several other teachers had noticed the change in classroom dynamics since the library incident. Students who had previously been quiet and withdrawn were participating more actively in discussions. Others, who had seemed anxious or stressed, were appearing more relaxed and confident. The entire social atmosphere of the school felt lighter somehow, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted. "I want you to know," Mr. Thompson concluded, "that what you did took real courage. Not just the physical courage to defend yourself, but the moral courage to refuse to accept a situation that was fundamentally wrong. You should be proud of that." The conversation left Kendra with a new understanding of the broader implications of her actions. She had thought of the library confrontation as a personal turning point, a moment when she finally found the strength to stand up for herself. But apparently, it had also been a catalyst for larger changes in the school's social environment, inspiring other students to re-evaluate their own situations and relationships. That evening, Kendra drove to Master Kim's studio for her regular training session, but her approach to the practice felt different from any session she had experienced in the 6 years since she had started training. For the first time, she had used her martial arts skills in a real-world situation, and the experience had fundamentally changed her relationship with her training. Master Kim was waiting for her when she arrived, his expression thoughtful and alert. Word of the library incident had reached him through the parent network that connected most of the families in their small community, and he had spent considerable time thinking about how to discuss the situation with his student. "I heard you had an interesting day at school yesterday," he said, as Kendra changed into her training clothes. "You could say that," Kendra replied, uncertain how her instructor would react to her use of martial arts techniques against an untrained opponent. They went through their usual warm-up routine in silence, but Kendra could feel Master Kim's attention on her movements, assessing her mental state and emotional equilibrium. When they moved into technique practice, he finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. Kendra recounted the library incident in detail, describing Blake's escalating harassment campaign, the moment when he grabbed her sweater, and her decision to use physical force to defend herself. She spoke clinically and precisely, analyzing her own actions with the same attention to detail she brought to studying tournament footage or practicing new techniques. Master Kim listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions about specific techniques or timing. When she finished her account, he was quiet for several minutes, considering what she had told him. "You used Aikido to break his grip," he said finally. "Then, joint control to take him to the ground, minimum force necessary to end the immediate threat, with clear warnings about consequences for continued aggression. Good technique, good control, good judgment." The approval in his voice was unmistakable, and Kendra felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been worried that her instructor might disapprove of her use of martial arts against an untrained opponent, despite the circumstances that had prompted her actions. "You waited until all other options were exhausted," Master Kim continued. "You tried avoidance, you tried endurance, you tried non-engagement. Only when he escalated to physical assault did you respond with physical techniques. This is exactly what martial arts training is for, not to dominate others, but to protect yourself and others when necessary." They spent the rest of the session working on advanced techniques, but the practice felt different to Kendra now. Instead of abstract movements practiced for their own sake, each technique felt connected to real-world applications and moral responsibilities. She understood now, in a way she never had before, why Master Kim had always emphasized the philosophical aspects of martial arts training alongside the physical techniques. "Power without wisdom is dangerous," he said as they concluded the session. "But wisdom without power is often helpless. You have been developing both for 6 years. Yesterday, you finally had the opportunity to demonstrate both." The weekend passed quietly for Kendra, who spent Saturday catching up on homework and Sunday helping her father with household projects they had been putting off for months. But Monday morning brought an unexpected development that would test her newfound confidence in ways she hadn't anticipated. Blake Morrison was waiting by her locker when she arrived at school, but he looked nothing like the arrogant, intimidating figure who had terrorized her for weeks. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well, and his entire posture radiated defeat and exhaustion. Tyler was nowhere to be seen, He had apparently made good on his decision to distance himself from his former friend as completely as possible. "We need to talk," Blake said as Kendra approached her locker. "No," Kendra replied simply, working her combination without looking at him. "We don't. Look, about Thursday. Thursday you physically assaulted me in front of half the school," Kendra said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that hadn't been there a week ago. "You grabbed my clothing without permission and exposed my body to humiliate me. There's nothing to talk about." Blake's face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The past 4 days had been the worst of his life, filled with conversations with his disappointed parents, the loss of his girlfriend and most of his friends, and the growing realization that his reputation at Jefferson High School was permanently destroyed. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, his voice desperate. "I was just trying to put you in your place, you know? I didn't think I never expected you to be able to defend myself," Kendra finished, turning to face him directly. "You didn't expect me to be able to defend myself against a sexual assault." The word assault made Blake flinch visibly. Over the weekend, his father had made it very clear that what he had done in the library could be classified as sexual assault under state law, and that the only reason he wasn't facing criminal charges was that Kendra and her family had chosen not to press the matter further. "It wasn't assault," Blake said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. "What would you call it?" Kendra asked, echoing the same question his father had posed. "You physically grabbed my clothing and exposed my body against my will. You did it intentionally, in public, to degrade and humiliate me. If that's not sexual assault, what is?" Blake opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The past few days had forced him to confront the reality of his actions in ways he had been avoiding for years. Stripped of his social status and forced to examine his behavior without the protective buffer of his popularity, he was beginning to understand that what he had dismissed as harmless pranks and social enforcement had actually been systematic abuse. "I won't bother you anymore," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Good," Kendra said, "because if you do, what happened Thursday will seem like a friendly conversation." She closed her locker and walked away, leaving Blake standing alone in the hallway with the weight of his own actions and their consequences. Several students had witnessed the exchange, and word spread quickly that Blake Morrison had been reduced to begging for forgiveness from the girl he had tormented for weeks. But Blake's conversation with Kendra was only the beginning of his reckoning. Over the following days, he found himself confronted by the full extent of the damage his behavior had caused, not just to Kendra, but to numerous other students who had suffered under his regime of casual cruelty. Tyler's absence had created a power vacuum among Blake's former followers, and several of them had decided that their best strategy for social survival was to publicly distance themselves from their former leader. They began sharing stories about Blake's behavior that they had previously kept secret, describing incidents of harassment and intimidation that painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond what most students had realized. One particularly damaging revelation came from Jake Morrison, Blake's own younger brother, who was a sophomore at Jefferson High. Jake had always lived in Blake's shadow, benefiting from his brother's popularity while privately despising the cruelty that maintained it. With Blake's social armor finally cracked, Jake found the courage to speak publicly about what he had witnessed at home and at school. "He's been like this forever," Jake told a group of students during lunch period, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed frustration, always picking on kids who couldn't fight back, always finding new ways to make people feel small. "I used to think it was just how popular kids acted, but watching him target Kendra for weeks, it made me realize that my brother is actually just a sadist." The use of the word sadist was deliberate and devastating. It suggested that Blake's behavior wasn't just misguided teenage social dynamics, but something darker and more pathological. Combined with the video footage of the library incident that had been circulating on social media, Jake's testimony completed the destruction of Blake's carefully constructed image. Ashley Chen's decision to break up with Blake had also sent shockwaves through the school's social hierarchy. As head cheerleader and student council vice president, Ashley's romantic choices carried significant social weight, and her public rejection of Blake served as a powerful statement about the kind of behavior that would no longer be tolerated by the popular crowd. "I can't be with someone who treats other people like that," Ashley told her friends, making sure her reasons for the breakup were clearly understood. "I don't care how popular he is or how good he looks. What he did to Kendra was disgusting, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to protect my social status." Ashley's moral stand inspired other popular students to re-evaluate their own relationships and associations. Several of Blake's former friends began openly criticizing his behavior, sharing their own uncomfortable memories of incidents they had previously dismissed or ignored. The popular crowd that had once provided Blake with social protection was not just abandoning him, but actively working to distance themselves from his toxic legacy. The administrative response to the library incident was swift and decisive, though it came after the fact rather than as a preventive measure. Principal Williams, who had been largely oblivious to Blake's harassment campaigns, found herself forced to confront the reality that systematic bullying had been occurring under her nose for years. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of behavior that was far more extensive and damaging than anyone in the administration had realized. Multiple students came forward with accounts of harassment, intimidation, and psychological abuse that Blake and Tyler had inflicted over the past several years. Some had tried to report the incidents previously, but had been dismissed by teachers who viewed them as normal teenage conflicts rather than systematic abuse. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian who had witnessed the final confrontation, provided a detailed account of Blake's behavior in the library over the preceding weeks. Her testimony revealed that the incident with Kendra had been the culmination of a sustained campaign of harassment that had escalated gradually from verbal abuse to physical intimidation to sexual assault. "I should have intervened sooner," Mrs. Patterson told Principal Williams during the investigation. "I could see that he was systematically targeting that poor girl, but I kept hoping it would resolve itself naturally. I failed in my responsibility to protect students in my space." The investigation's findings were damning for both Blake and the school's administration. Blake faced a 2-week suspension, mandatory counseling sessions, and a permanent mark on his disciplinary record that would affect his college applications and scholarship opportunities. More significantly, he was banned from participating in any extracurricular activities for the remainder of his senior year, effectively ending his athletic career and eliminating any chance of receiving sports scholarships. Tyler Kane faced similar consequences, though his decision to transfer to another school meant that most of his punishment would be carried out elsewhere. His departure was seen by most students as an admission of guilt and cowardice, and his reputation followed him to his new school through social media connections and word-of-mouth communications. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the incident was the change it brought to Jefferson High School's overall culture and climate. The exposure of Blake's systematic harassment campaign had forced students, teachers, and administrators to confront the reality that bullying was a serious problem that required proactive intervention rather than passive hope that it would resolve itself. Principal Williams implemented new policies requiring teachers to report all incidents of harassment, no matter how minor they might seem. Counselors began conducting regular check-ins with students who appeared isolated or distressed. The school resource officer started conducting educational sessions about harassment, assault, and students' rights and responsibilities. More importantly, The student body itself began to take responsibility for creating a more inclusive and supportive environment. Student Council passed a resolution condemning harassment and promising to actively support victims of bullying. Various clubs and organizations began reaching out to isolated students, offering friendship and community to those who had been marginalized by the previous social hierarchy. The transformation of Jefferson High School's social landscape created opportunities for students who had previously been relegated to the margins, and Kendra found herself at the center of a new social network that valued authenticity and mutual support over status and dominance. Her friendship with Marcus deepened into something that neither of them had expected when they first met in the library. Their shared love of learning and discussion provided a foundation for increasingly personal conversations about their families, their dreams, and their plans for the future. Marcus's quiet confidence and genuine kindness had given Kendra the courage to believe in herself, while her intelligence and resilience had shown him the kind of strength that didn't depend on dominating others. "You know," Marcus said one afternoon as they worked together on a new project about reconstruction policies, "I've been thinking about what happened that day in the library. Not just the fight, but everything leading up to it." They were sitting in their usual spot near the windows, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Other students occasionally joined their table, contributing to discussions or simply enjoying the company of people who valued substance over superficiality. The library had become a genuine community space rather than a hunting ground for predators. "What about it?" Kendra asked, looking up from her notes. "I keep thinking about how long you endured Blake's harassment before you finally fought back," Marcus said. "The patience it must have taken, the self-control. Most people would have snapped a lot sooner." "My father always told me to pick my battles," Kendra replied. "He said some fights aren't worth winning, and some victories cost more than they're worth. I was trying to follow that advice." "But you also knew that you could have stopped it at any time," Marcus observed. "You had the skills to shut Blake down from the very beginning. You chose to endure his abuse rather than use your training against him." Kendra nodded slowly. "Master Kim taught me that martial arts skills come with responsibilities. He said that with the ability to hurt people comes the obligation to find other solutions whenever possible. I kept hoping that Blake would get bored and find someone else to bother. But he didn't," Marcus said. "He just kept escalating until you had no choice but to stop him." "That's what my dad said," Kendra agreed. "He said that sometimes endurance becomes enablement, that by not standing up for myself, I was actually encouraging Blake to hurt other people. Maybe if I had fought back sooner, some of those other kids wouldn't have suffered as much as they did." This conversation reflected a broader theme in Kendra's new understanding of herself and her place in the world. The library incident had taught her that there was a difference between choosing peace and accepting abuse, between being patient and being passive. She had learned that sometimes the most moral action required the courage to use force, even when doing so violated her natural inclination toward nonviolence. The martial arts club that Kendra started at Jefferson High School became one of the most popular new organizations in the school's history, attracting students from all different social backgrounds who were interested in learning self-defense techniques and exploring the philosophical aspects of martial arts training. Master Kim agreed to visit the school once a week to help with instruction, bringing with him decades of experience and a teaching philosophy that emphasized character development alongside physical training. His presence lent credibility to the program and helped ensure that students learned proper techniques safely and responsibly. "Self-defense is not about learning to fight," Master Kim explained to the club members during one of his first visits. "Self-defense is about learning to avoid fights whenever possible, to de-escalate conflicts before they become violent, and to protect yourself and others only when necessary. The physical techniques are important, but they are only one part of a larger philosophy about how to live with strength and wisdom. The club attracted students like David Park, who had been bullied in middle school and wanted to develop the confidence to stand up for himself. It drew athletes like Emma Thompson, who was interested in cross-training to improve her performance in other sports. It even attracted some of Blake's former followers, who were struggling to find their place in the new social order and were looking for ways to rebuild their identities around more positive values. One of the most surprising members was Madison Wells, Tyler's former girlfriend, who had been deeply affected by the realization that she had been complicit in harassment campaigns through her silence and inaction. She threw herself into the martial arts training with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. "I spent so much time being afraid," Madison explained to Kendra after one particularly intense training session. "Afraid of losing my social status, afraid of being targeted myself, afraid of standing up for what I knew was right. Learning to defend myself physically is helping me learn to defend my principles too." This theme of personal transformation and moral growth ran through many of the club members' experiences. Students who had previously felt powerless began to develop confidence not just in their physical abilities, but in their capacity to make positive changes in their own lives and their community. The club also served as a bridge between different social groups that had previously been segregated by Jefferson High's rigid hierarchy. Athletes worked alongside theater kids, honor students practiced with students who struggled academically, and popular kids trained with those who had been social outcasts. The shared experience of learning challenging techniques and supporting each other through difficult training sessions created bonds that transcended traditional social boundaries. Kendra's relationship with her father also evolved in the months following the library incident. Robert Thorne had always been proud of his daughter's intelligence and character, but seeing her find the courage to stand up for herself had given him a new appreciation for her strength and resilience. "You know," he said one evening as they worked together in their small garage, rebuilding an engine for a neighbor's car, "your mother would have been so proud of what you did at school. Not just the fighting back part, but everything else. The patience you showed, the way you tried to solve the problem peacefully first, the way you've used the whole experience to help other kids." Kendra looked up from the carburetor she was cleaning, surprised by the sudden mention of her mother. Robert rarely talked about his deceased wife, finding the memories too painful to discuss casually. "She always said that real strength wasn't about being the toughest or the loudest," Robert continued. "She said real strength was about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone make you into something smaller. You've shown that kind of strength, sweetheart. You've shown exactly the kind of person she hoped you would become." The conversation led to a longer discussion about Kendra's mother and the values she had tried to instill in her daughter during the brief time they had together. It was the most in-depth conversation about her mother that Kendra had ever had with her father, and it helped her understand the ways in which her response to Blake's harassment had been shaped by principles her mother had taught her years earlier. As the school year progressed, the changes at Jefferson High School became more pronounced and permanent. The student council, now led by students who prioritized inclusion and community building over social status, implemented new programs designed to support students who were struggling socially or academically. Teachers reported improved classroom dynamics and increased participation from students who had previously been quiet and withdrawn. The administration also made significant changes to their policies and procedures, implementing better training for staff on recognizing and responding to harassment, creating clearer reporting mechanisms for students who were experiencing problems, and establishing consequences for students who engaged in systematic bullying. But perhaps most importantly, the student body itself had internalized new norms and expectations about acceptable behavior. Students who had previously been bystanders to harassment began intervening when they witnessed bullying. Popular students used their social influence to include, rather than exclude, their more vulnerable classmates. The entire culture of the school shifted towards supporting rather than tearing down those who were different or struggling. The ultimate test of how completely things had changed at Jefferson High School came in early December, when Blake Morrison made one final attempt to reconcile with the community he had damaged. 2 months after the library incident, Blake had undergone mandatory counseling that had forced him to confront the reality of his behavior and its impact on others. His therapist had helped him understand that his need to dominate and humiliate others had stemmed from his own deep-seated insecurities and his fear that he wasn't actually as special or worthy as everyone believed him to be. The counseling process had been painful and humiliating for someone who had built his identity around never showing weakness or vulnerability. Blake had been forced to examine incidents from his past that he had rationalized or forgotten, to consider the perspectives of students he had always dismissed as irrelevant, and to accept responsibility for damage he had caused without the comfort of excuses or justifications. On a cold December morning, almost 2 months after their last confrontation, Blake approached Kendra one final time. But everything about this encounter was different from their previous interactions. He stopped at a respectful distance from her locker, waited patiently for her to finish organizing her books, and spoke in a quiet voice that showed none of his former arrogance. "Kendra," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to apologize to you. Really apologize, not just try to make excuses or minimize what I did." Kendra studied his face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But what she saw was genuine remorse and a level of emotional exhaustion that suggested he had been wrestling with difficult truths about himself. "I've been going to counseling," Blake continued, "trying to understand why I felt like I needed to hurt people to feel good about myself. And I've been thinking about all the things I did to you, all the ways I tried to make you feel small and worthless." He paused, struggling to find words that would adequately express the magnitude of his regret. "I was a coward, Kendra. I made you feel small because I felt small. I hurt you because I thought it would make me feel better about myself. I was wrong about everything, and I'm sorry." Kendra considered his words carefully, weighing them against months of humiliation and fear. She could see that Blake was genuinely struggling with the conversation, that apologizing required him to confront aspects of himself that he would prefer to ignore. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I want to be better than I was," Blake said. "Because I want to be someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. And I can't do that until I face what I've done and try to make amends. What about Tyler? What about all the other people you hurt over the years?" Blake's shoulders sagged with the weight of that larger reckoning. "Tyler won't talk to me. Neither will most of the others. I don't blame them. I probably wouldn't want to talk to me either, but I had to start somewhere, and I wanted to start with you because what I did to you was the worst thing I've ever done to another person." The admission seemed to cost him something significant, as if acknowledging the full extent of his actions required him to surrender the last vestiges of the identity he had built around being superior to others. "I know you have no reason to forgive me," Blake continued. "I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, that I'm trying to change, and that I'm sorry for every moment of pain I caused you." Kendra felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to Blake's apology. There was anger for what he had put her through, sadness for the boy who had been so broken that he could only feel whole by breaking others, and a grudging respect for the courage it must have taken to face her with such honest vulnerability. "I accept your apology," she said finally, "but accepting your apology doesn't mean I forgive you, and it doesn't mean I'll forget what you did. It just means I'm willing to believe that you're trying to be different." "That's more than I deserve," Blake said. "Thank you." "Blake," Kendra said as he started to turn away, "the people you hurt, some of them might never get over what you did to them. Some of them might carry those scars for the rest of their lives. If you really want to make amends, you need to understand that and find ways to use your experience to prevent other people from going through what they went through." Blake nodded, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I know. I'm trying to figure out how to do that." They parted ways after that conversation, and Kendra never spoke to Blake Morrison again during their remaining months at Jefferson High School. But she occasionally heard updates about his efforts to rebuild his life and identity around more positive values. He volunteered at a local program for at-risk youth, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of using power to hurt others. He wrote letters to some of his former victims, though many of them chose not to respond. He worked with the school administration to develop better anti-bullying programs. Whether Blake's transformation was genuine and permanent would be determined by his actions in the years to come. But Kendra found some satisfaction in knowing that their confrontation had forced him to confront the reality of his behavior and its consequences. Sometimes the most important victories were not about defeating enemies, but about forcing them to become better people. Epilogue. Finding her voice. Graduation day at Jefferson High School arrived on a perfect May morning, with the kind of bright sunshine and gentle breeze that made everything seem possible. Kendra sat with her classmates in the folding chairs arranged on the football field, wearing her cap and gown and reflecting on everything that had changed during her 4 years at the school. She had been selected as the salutatorian, finishing second in her class academically, and would be attending the state university in the fall on a partial academic scholarship. Her acceptance letter to the honors program had arrived in March, along with an invitation to participate in a special leadership development program for students who had demonstrated exceptional character and resilience. More importantly, she was graduating as someone who had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. The quiet, invisible girl who had started her senior year hiding behind oversized clothes and defensive postures was gone, replaced by someone who stood tall, spoke clearly, and refused to apologize for taking up space in the world. Marcus sat 2 rows ahead of her, having graduated in the top 10% of the class and earned admission to several excellent universities. Their relationship had evolved over the school year from friendship to something deeper and more significant, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. They had decided to attend universities in the same state, close enough to maintain their relationship while still having room to grow and develop independently. The martial arts club that Kendra had founded had grown to include nearly 50 students and had become one of the most respected organizations at Jefferson High School. Master Kim had been so impressed with the students' dedication and progress that he had offered several of them opportunities to continue training at his studio after graduation, and 2 had already expressed interest in pursuing martial arts instruction as a career path. As Principal Williams called out the names of graduating seniors, Kendra thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The library incident that had seemed so dramatic and life-changing at the time now felt like just one important step in a longer process of discovering who she was and who she wanted to become. She had learned that strength wasn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most feared. Real strength came from knowing who you were, standing up for what was right, and choosing to be better even when others chose to be worse. She had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them that their victim was stronger than they had imagined, but that true victory came not from destroying your enemies, but from refusing to let them destroy you. Most importantly, she had learned that her voice mattered, that her thoughts and feelings and experiences were worth defending, and that she had a responsibility to use her strength to protect not just herself, but others who might not be able to protect themselves. When Principal Williams called her name, Kendra walked across the stage with her head held high and her heart full of hope for the future. She accepted her diploma, shook hands with the school board members, and smiled for the photographer who captured the moment for posterity. As she returned to her seat, Kendra caught sight of Blake Morrison sitting with his family in the audience. He had not been allowed to participate in graduation due to his disciplinary record, but his parents had come to watch the ceremony anyway. When their eyes met briefly across the crowd, Blake nodded once. A simple acknowledgement that seemed to contain years of complicated history and mutual understanding. Kendra nodded back, then turned her attention to the future that lay ahead of her. She was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities awaited her, secure in the knowledge that she would never let anyone make her feel small again. The girl who had once hidden in shadows now walked in the light, her head held high, her heart full of hope for the future. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world, and she would never be invisible again.